It's certainly my pleasure to welcome Ron Brown, and as he takes us to Christopher Street in New York City. Take it away, Ron.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And it's a pleasure to be back at Port Washington, even though neither me nor Jeff nor anybody here is actually physically at that magnificent library on the North Shore, but yet we are getting together through the modern technology of Zoom. Now, before we begin, as you'll notice on the right, we see a list of people's faces with me at the top. And I especially like the picture of Jill Rezek because she has the moon behind her. So it is look like she has a halo. So I mean this, I don't know whether that's intentional, but it is really a divine experience, Jill. So now you are on mute, so you can't talk to me, but it's really wonderful to see that we have not only saints, but as well sinners among our group. So good luck, Jill. Wonderful. Okay, well, once again, my name is Ron Brown. Some people call me Dr. Ron Brown. Other people call me other things, but usually it is Ron Brown. Now, today we are going to be talking about Christopher Street, which is a gay city within a city. And just recently, I was looking at all of the talks I've given out there at the Port Washington Library, and I saw that the very first one I gave was back in 2010. So I have been talking at the Fort Washington Library for a good 10, 15 years now, and it's really a wonderful place. So it's a great experience for me to be there once again. Now, what I'm doing these days is what we call important places, cities in world history. The last one I gave last month was the history of Flushing, which is the birthplace of religious freedom, religious diversity in the United States. And so this is part of that series. On July 10th, I'll be back talking about the Lower East Side, a fascinating city within a city. So we will be continuing this series and hopefully well into the future. Now, as you probably know, June is Gay History Month, which is a time when people take interest in gays and lesbians and various other sexual minorities. And a lot happened in New York City in the history of gays and lesbians and other people of sexual minorities. And so this is really a topic on city within a city. Now, this is the same class I would give to my students at Touro College. So that's why I have an outline. Now, if you were my students, I would be giving you hell and tell you, why aren't you taking notes? Because you're going to have to listen to this and write me a 700-word essay, and you're going to have to send it to me if you expect to pass the class. So if anybody wants to write the essay and send it to me, that's fine, but I won't require it. But once again, this is the outline. I will speak for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we will take questions. If you have questions, you can type them in on the chat line, and Jeff will moderate that. And then afterwards, we will open the mics and anybody can give any comments that they'd like to give. So let's get going. Well, the outline is New York City, which is a city of cities, followed by gay New Amsterdam. I mean, we don't think of the Dutch period as being exceptionally gay, but it was. The gay 20s, when there was really an explosion of gay life in New York, and New York became the mecca for gays and lesbians and other sexual minorities. Then the 1960s, when Christopher Street entered history, and began the gay revolution. Stonewall riots, flowering of gay culture, and then what is going on today? Another entire chapter in gay history. So let's get going. Hopefully I can advance it. There we go. Now, I live in Queens, and I'm sure a lot of you have either been to New York or you know New York and you have visited it. And you know that it is really a city of many cities. The famous Lower East Side, which I'll be talking about on July 10th, again at noon. A fascinating chapter in an entire ethnic neighborhood made up of 500,000 Eastern European immigrant Yiddish-speaking Jews. You had the Klein Deutschland, where New York City was the third largest German-speaking city in the world after Berlin and Vienna. Little Italy, or one of the many Little Italies, which carved out a neighborhood and several neighborhoods where Italian and Italian-American culture flourished. Harlem, the African-American Renaissance of the 1910 to 1927 and after, where Harlem became the largest African city in the world. More African origin people in Harlem than there were in any city in Africa, something we just simply don't remember. Or the Barrio America, Spanish Harlem, Puerto Ricans and later Mexicans and everybody else moving into the city. And what I talked about the last time was Flushing, today the largest Asian city in the United States. Every time I take the 7 train, now of course we don't call it the 7 train anymore, it's called the Asia Express. But you go to Flushing and you see that skyscrapers are sprouting like mushrooms, restaurants, Buddhist temples. Once again, an entire Asian city within the city of New York. Now, I live in Queens. In fact, you may have heard of the infamous Elmhurst Hospital, which has been sort of ground zero for the pandemic. Well, my house is a couple blocks away. But I remember a couple weeks ago when 800 people per day were dying in the city, Queens Boulevard, which goes right near my house, was a nonstop train of ambulances taking people to the Elmhurst Hospital. But if you look at this map showing all the different colors, I mean, it is a crazy quilt of ethnic neighborhoods. The people who just bought my building where I live are Chinese. People next door are Puerto Ricans. Across the street is an old Hungarian family. We have Indians all over. I mean, it is an ethnic crazy quilt of new immigrants. And so every neighborhood has its grocery stores. It has its video stores. It has its own cultural infrastructure with churches or temples or synagogues or mosques. Half of my students at Toro at the Forest Hills campus where I teach are from Central Asia, Jews from Bukharia, the Bukharians speaking Jews who migrated and carved out their own ethnic neighborhood in the middle of Queens. Well, this is New York today. And it has been New York from the very beginning. When the English, or I mean the Dutch, first claimed in Manhattan Island and Long Island and Staten Island, and they carved out the Dutch Empire in North America, they claimed a huge area, which was most of Connecticut, half of Massachusetts, all of New York State, all of Pennsylvania, all of New Jersey, and Delaware. It was a huge land claim. And Peter Stuyvesant, who was governor from 1647 to 1664, ruled over his colony with an iron fist. And there you see him on the left with his peg leg, and the most beloved governor of New York City, or as it was called back then, New Amsterdam. And on the right, we see a map of Peter Stuyvesant's New Amsterdam. You see, going from the top to the bottom is the city wall, which is today Wall Street, the big street at the going right and left. That is today Broadway, with Fort Amsterdam at the bottom. Well, Peter Stuyvesant was desperate to populate his colony because he knew the English were up there in Boston, these fierce Puritans. He knew that the English were down in Virginia, and they were eager to grab the rich lands of upstate New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, so that if he didn't populate his colony, he was going to lose it, which is in fact what happened in 1664 when the English sailed into New York Harbor and said, "Surrender or we will demolish the colony." Well, Peter Stuyvesant advertised right and left, "I need settlers." Well, many young guys and young girls picked up from their homelands in Germany, in Denmark, in France, in Austria, even in Italy and Lithuania. Sephardic Jews showed up, Chinese showed up, migrating to the colony. Well, Peter Stuyvesant was a fierce Dutch Reformed Christian. There you see on the map on the left a drawing of Fort Amsterdam with the Dutch windmill, and in the middle was the Dutch Reformed Church of St. Nicholas. Well, the Dutch Reformed Christians were fiercely Bible reading. Christmas was outlawed in New York and New Amsterdam under pain of imprisonment because the December 25th date is nowhere to be found in the Bible. So according to the Dutch Reformed, if it's not in the Bible, it is not Christian. Alcohol was banned. Any celebration of these pagan holidays like Mardi Gras, the spring holidays of the maypole, plays and popular music were banned as frivolous, devilish entertainment. Peter Stuyvesant passed a law that said knife fighting on the Sabbath was a crime punishable by imprisonment. Any exchange of money, gold or coins, or even barter on the Sabbath was forbidden. By law, the Dutch Reformed were obliged to go to church in the morning, 9 to 12, a brief lunch break, and back at 1 to 4, because this was the tradition in Holland. The only church allowed to publicly worship were the Dutch churches. He even passed a law, which is still on the books, interestingly, outlawing sex between the Dutch and the Indians and the slaves. So this is something that is puritanical in its roots. We think of the Puritans up in Boston, but we forget that New Amsterdam under the Dutch and later under the English was fiercely puritanical. Well, unfortunately, the people who responded to Peter Stuyvesant's drive to get settlers were principally young men. Either a young man escaping his wife and 5 kids back in Holland or Germany or England or Scotland or wherever, or some young guy one step ahead of the police for stealing a horse. But these were the kinds of people who were migrating to colonial New Amsterdam. And various descriptions of the population of New Amsterdam where we can see here, the people are grown very wild and loose in their morals. We have seen contempt of God's holy law and ordinances, whereof God help us. diary entrances and even newspaper articles at the time talk about the sins, the scandals, the debaucheries and crimes of New Amsterdam, and warning a sky laden with vengeance if the people of New York do not mend their ways. Now, according to my family, in obscure places like Arkansas and South Carolina and rural Pennsylvania, would say that pretty aptly describes New York City today. So there is a certain continuity of New Amsterdam as being a Sodom on the Hudson River. Well, looking back to the law and the criminal records from the Dutch and later on the English periods, we see people being arrested for crimes, the ones just previously described. And here we see from June 25th, my God, so pretty soon we're going to celebrate the anniversary, but that was back in 1646. Where you see a young Dutch colonial being arrested for having sex with Jan Creole, a Negro, for the second sodomy offense. I mean, all these young guys migrating to New Amsterdam to seek their fortune. Well, there were no women here. And so sodomy, what we would call today homosexual crime, was rampant in New York, even going back to the colonial period. And he was to be conveyed to the place of execution and there choked to death and then burnt to ashes. And his justification for this, there were cited Genesis and Leviticus, and he was duly executed. Another crime was Manuel Congo, a lad of 10 years old, upon whom the crime was committed. Flogging was a daily occurrence almost in New Amsterdam because it was a predominantly male colony. Indians would come to do trade. African slaves were brought here. Many the population of New Amsterdam came here to make a fortune and then go back to their country of origin. So it was a male society, and it had all of the attributes of a college frat house with all of its debauchery and alcohol and crime, which Peter Stuyvesant did everything he could to stamp out. 1658, 1660, more crimes against people committing sodomy. I mean, and these are the Dutch records. I've seen the original up in Albany, where they are carefully preserved, giving an insight into what was going on in New Amsterdam. And here, I love this one on the left. He was ordered to be taken to the place of execution and then stripped of his arms, his sword broken at his feet. He then was tied into a sack and cast into the river and drowned till dead. I mean, this is the kind of punishment for the rampant crime of what we would today consider gay sex, but back then it was the crime of sodomy. Well, the English took over, and into the story marched one of the most puritanical of English governors. This was Governor Edward Hyde. You can see his portrait on the left, who was governor of New York after the English took over, governor from 1701 to 1708, the most notorious transvestite in New York history. And here we see his official portrait, which until today hangs in the New York Historical Society. Well, Governor Hyde declared war against immorality in New York. He built a big church and he named it St. George's Church. And he said, I have been sent by God to command St. George to slay the dragon of immorality in New York City. Well, along with immorality, St. George was supposed to slay the heresy of Quakers and Baptists. But of course, as you can see, he was only here 7 years and caused so much scandal for walking the walls of the city and picking up English soldiers for some fun and appearing in public dressed as a woman that he was recalled to England. Well, New York had a well-established and deep gay history going back to the colonial period. And this continued in the early Republic, where coming to New York was a great adventure for young guys. Back in the 1800s, we have stories of Harvard students coming to New York and expecting to have a wonderful gay time in the city. Well, gay life in New York really exploded back in the so-called gay 20s. World War I was instrumental in reinforcing this image of New York City as a gay city. So many soldiers came from places like North Dakota or Arkansas or Texas, joined the army, went off to Europe, and when they returned, hey, once they've seen Paris, you can't send them back to the farm. So they ended up staying in New York. And this began the post-World War I explosion of free sex, lesbians, gays, cross-dressing, which New York became the center of. On the right, you see Marlene Dietrich in one of her male costumes. The film Cabaret with Lisa Minnelli was part of this, where gender bending, as we call it now, was par for the course. In New York, you could explore your sexuality. It became a mecca for people seeking sexual liberation. See a wonderful book by James Wilson, Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies, Performance, Race, and Sexuality in the Harlem Renaissance. Josephine Baker, once again dressed as a man, presided over some of the greatest clubs in Harlem. In fact, I lived in Europe for many, many years, and French really became my first language. And I remember going to Paris and everybody talking about Josephine Baker. Well, it was a couple years later that I realized that Josephine Baker was actually Josephine Baker, who was so outrageous that she fled New York and ended up in Paris, which had even more reputation as a decadent city. During the age of Prohibition, a speakeasy was not just about alcohol, but once you were in, there were men dancing with men, women dancing with women. And so the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the 20s, became synonymous with sexual liberation. Women were no longer wearing the corset. Their hair was no longer up in a bun with pins. Their dress was no longer to the floor, but there were liberated women and a host of liberated men as well. Interestingly, the Gay Society of New York and other major cities flourished among the wealthy. In fact, there were scandals at Harlem where the sons of multi-billionaires were given great amount of freedom. The police would never raid a Harvard dorm to arrest a bunch of guys having a sex party or dancing together. But what was interesting is in the 1920s, there was a lower class gay life, which also flourished. And these were the bars of Harlem. These were the bars of Lower Manhattan, the famous Bowery, where a young guy could, an immigrant very often could explore his own sexuality. Prostitution, both male and female along the Bowery, were very popular. So it really expanded a long tradition of upper class gay freedom to the lower classes and the middle classes, which is really unique about the 1920s. It was more of a democratic approach to sexuality, which didn't mean that the bars were not being raided. People were not being arrested. Parks were not being surveyed by the police. But it was, New York was notorious for being more liberal than most other cities. Well, the golden age of gay liberation again exploded following the Second World War. So many soldiers marching off to war in World War II. Well, once again, when they came back to the United States, they were not going back to the farm in North Dakota. They were not going back to mom and papa in Arkansas or Texas or Georgia. Once they had experienced the world, they settled in New York. And this whole post-war generation spawned a host of liberation movements. Don't forget that hundreds of thousands of Africans and Asians and people from Latin America served in the British, the French, and the American army as volunteers. And they experienced freedom. And by the 1960s, there was a wave of liberation movements from Ho Chi Minh, who had fought in World War II with the French, demanding liberation for Vietnam. Kenyatta, Kenya, demanding freedom in Africa. Young Africans from South Africa demanding freedom from apartheid. Puerto Rican liberation movement, the Prague Spring of '68. Palestinians who had served in the British Army demanding liberation from occupation by Israel. So there was a widespread revolutionary movement of all kinds of oppressed people. In the United States, it was not only gays who started demanding their rights and a freedom from police oppression, but women, beginning of the Equal Rights Amendment, Native Americans demanding freedom, African Americans, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Hispanics demanding right. The Catholic Church was in ferment with Vatican II, demanding a modernization of the Catholic Church. And at the same time in the 60s, the United States threw open the doors of immigration with the passage of the Hart-Celler Immigration Reform Act of 1965, when New York even was flooded with immigrants, from Hispanics from all Mexico and Dominican Republic and every place else in Latin America, Koreans and Chinese and Vietnamese, people from the Middle East, Persians, Arabs, Turks, and Africans were flooding into the United States. And so this was, the 1960s was an age of demanding your rights, demanding your freedom. Well, baby boomers, myself included, I was born in 1949, and I'll bet a lot of people listening to me today were also baby boomers. We know what the baby boom generation was about. Women were liberated with the pill. They could have free sex just like men, and they didn't have to worry about being stuck with the baby. New York was the first state to liberalize abortion, so-called on demand. Women got the right to demand a divorce just like the men. Men and women were going to college. For the first time, the bulk of the baby boom generation was going to college. And you can imagine college dorms and frat houses without adult supervision became a hotbed of experimentation, sexual and otherwise. Many people ran off to communes, which were abolishing the mom and the pop family. It was freedom for everyone. Free love, singles culture. It was a rejection of everything that our parents had taught us. The baby boomers were drug off to school and synagogue and church by their parents, but as soon as they got away from their parents, it was freedom for all. Our generation rejected the Bible teaching, be fruitful and multiply. Adam and Eve, well, let's have a rejection of sexual gender roles. Marriage was no longer a sacrament. You lived with somebody even without marriage, and you experimented sexually. So the post-war period for the baby boom generation was a period of liberation. Liberation from schools, liberation from the army, liberation from the government, liberation from the parents, from churches, from synagogues. It was a generation which demanded freedom from all forms of oppression. And one of the most ancient and fierce instruments of oppression for the baby boom generation was the ideal of the heterosexual family. Mom and pop and the kids. Adam and Eve story. They're deeply rooted in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, Hinduism, as well as fascism, communism, and the evangelical Protestants of today, the Jerry Falwells, the great religious reformers of the United States, all considered the heterosexual family as the basis of a stable society. Well, unfortunately for them, the baby boom generation was saying, well, there are other alternatives, and we are going to explore them. Now, the 50s and 60s was a period of very vicious anti-gay and lesbian and sexual minority oppression. Television shows, Father Knows Best, reinstated the male patriarchal family. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, loyalty to your country, a straight living life. Leave It to Beaver. The television broadcast the patriarchal family around the world. People were going to church. People were going to synagogue. People were lusting after the heterosexual marriage, which is why the 60s were so revolutionary. Because on one hand, you sat in front of the television with your parents and watched Father Knows Best. There was no gay people in Father Knows Best, nor was there a show Mother Knows Best. It was a male patriarchal society. And this is what the baby boom generation was revolting against. Well, gays had been coming to Christopher Street since the mid-1800s, always under the cover of darkness, always sneaking into a bar, making with the doorman to make sure that only the correct people would come in. Well, in New York, while it was tolerant, still, when the police wanted to raid a gay bar, it was acceptable. I mean, gay bashing was acceptable. Raids on gay saunas or gay bathhouses or gay parks, Central Park or Forest Hills Park. It was really open season for the police. Very often it was shakedown for money. Very often it was a bunch of roughneck guys and using a badge to beat up a bunch of faggots and gays and other people. Well, this was pretty much par for the course. People lived with it until June 28, 1969 at 1:20 a.m. when the Stonewall Tavern in just off of Christopher Street in Lower Manhattan endured one of its many police raids. At the time, it was illegal for people of the same sex to dance together or to show affection. Well, the police came in and started arresting people, roughing up people. Well, for the first time in gay New York history, the gay people fought back. And we see some pictures from the era. You can see it's all dark pictures because it was in the middle of the night when the police attacked. Well, generally, when there was such a raid, there was always a back door leading into an alley where the son of the mayor or the son of the Episcopal Archbishop or the Catholic priest, for that matter, could sneak out the back door and avoid the humiliation of being arrested. But that door was closed. And so there were mass arrests until the people started fighting back. Now, that is why June is Gay Pride Month. That is why the last weekend in June is the time of Gay Pride Parade, which this year, of course, was canceled because of the pandemic. But that really fixed this date in not only American, but as we're going to see in world history, world gay history, as June and the end of June as the sacred date for gay liberation. Interestingly, the New York Times carried this raid, not because they were scandalized, not because it was a terrible thing to happen. It happened all the time in New York and even worse in other cities, but they were arrested when 8 cops showed up, and it was a melee following an action at the bar, not a roundup or a raid or a harassment. 4 policemen were hurt. And it said that hundreds of young men went on a rampage as plainclothesmen raided a bar. It was a well-known haunt for its homosexual clientele. I mean, even the terminology, I mean, it was a raid. It was a haunt of gay, lesbians, and other people. The terminology here is mixed, but still, it was reported in the New York Times. Well, after this raid, the date in New York City became enshrined as the date of gay liberation. Interestingly, the very first gay pride was on June 28, 1970, when there were simultaneous parades in San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And Christopher Street became the symbol of gay freedom. And here you see the Gay Liberation Front news, Christopher Street Liberation Day. Now, this was interesting because New York has a lot of famous streets. When we think of business, we think of Wall Street. When we think of entertainment, we think of Broadway. When we think of elegant shopping, at least until the lockdown of a couple months ago, we think of Fifth Avenue. When we think of advertising, we think of Madison Avenue, famous TV series Mad Men. When we think of Harlem, we think of 125th Street. When we think of the Lower East Side, we think of Hester Street. When we think of Chinese, we think of Mott Street. Well, by 1968, a new street had been added to the map of New York City as a global symbol. And that was Christopher Street. Even if you had never gone to Christopher Street, even if you lived in China recently or France, Christopher Street had a symbolic power. And here we see the Gay Liberation Front news. Christopher Street Liberation Day, 1970. And all kinds of commentaries saying that this is the beginning of a change where homosexuals will be an integral part of society, that bigotry, prejudice, persecution, exploitation, even genocide will end in evoking Christopher Street. And so Christopher Street became a symbol for gays, not just sneaking around in parks and public toilets late at night, or women looking for each other in a bar, but these were the homosexuals who stand up and fight. And this became a symbol for a new breed of homosexuals. Now, the goal of the gay movement was not just liberation for gays and lesbians, but it was the freedom to discover your own sexuality. That it was no longer the Ken doll and the Barbie doll ideals that everyone should conform to, but there were loads of different people scattered along the continuum between Barb and Ken. And this gave rise to a whole new vocabulary for sexual diversity, where fantasy, prison rape became part of it, where you had the LGBT, which was lesbian, gay, bisexuality was explored. Transgender, a term which didn't even exist. What did that mean? BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism, asexuals, all kinds of fetishes, cross-dressing. I mean, half of these things, have bars on Christopher Street or in New York. Today, all of these groups have a website. I'm sure there are people giving at this very moment Zoom conferences on foot fetishes. I mean, these became acceptable. They became not only acceptable in bars, but the objects of scientific study, the diversity of sexual appetites. And so it was out of the closet and into the streets. Explore your sexuality. I love that one, Sex S&M. Whip yourself into shape. I mean, old slogans took on new meanings. I mean, dykes on bikes, where women were saying we don't have to wear pretty dresses and lace and makeup if we want to have our girlfriend and go riding on a Harley Davidson. Why not? And so this was a whole revolution in sexuality that began on Christopher Street. I went once to a party where a friend of mine was into Girth Mirth, where oversized gentlemen seek out each other. And here again, something that was humorous, that was a joke or the object of a joke, suddenly these men discovered each other. And here again, modern technology. Don't forget, this was all beginning in the 60s and 70s, when you had mass-produced magazines, then you had websites and internet, you had telephone lines where you could get in contact with other people. And so very often a person who thought he was the only person into overweight men or women suddenly discovered that there were many other people like him or like her. Well, this flowering of gay culture not only swept the websites, swept Zoom conferences, swept the internet, but it became, as everything eventually becomes, a source of money-making. Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro explored the seedier side of 42nd Street. Now, you can imagine these films, whether it's Priscilla of the Desert, an Australian film, fantastic. Chorale de Brest with Fassbinder, a French film, Pink Flamingos, a great films. But what was so interesting is these were no longer shown in 42nd Street peep shows or small art theaters, but more and more public libraries were carrying them. You could see them on television. You could order the movie. Even if you lived in some place in Idaho, you started realizing that there's a whole world out there, that I'm not the only one. So modern technology really picked up on the liberation movement begun at the Stonewall and on Christopher Street and spread it not only across the nation through the mass media, but as we're going to see, around the world. The famous village people staying at the YMCA. I mean, we think of the Young Men's Christian Association, but back in the 60s and the 70s, gays basically took over many of the YMCAs, and it became part of gay popular culture to go to New York or to San Francisco or Boston and stay at the YMCA. It was all men. It was like the military, where it became an all-male culture. But here again, everybody knew the village people. Everybody knew the song, Staying at the YMCA, Macho Man. I mean, these were gay-themed music groups and songs that gained a worldwide following. Well, gays were still largely shunned by the mainstream churches, and so you had the Metropolitan Community Church, the MCC, which still exists in many places, and in New York, once again, a safe place where the gays were saying, I'm not going to sit silently in a church which shuns me and pretend to be straight. I want a church where I can marry my friend. We can celebrate each other's freedom and sexuality. By 1978, there was the famous multicolored gay flag, which even today you see around the world, once again reflecting the diversity of gay life. The Blade, a newspaper. Every city had a gay and still has a gay men's chorus to show that gay men can be as cultivated as everybody else. Gay community centers were in every city where gays were not only tolerated, but they were welcomed and celebrated. SAGE, an organization for older gay men, once again, where therapists and counselors and social workers started saying, well, many gay men live alone, so we should have a gay community center where they will have their freedom to explore their own diversity. Part of the wonderful gay revolution following Christopher Street were the beginning of openly gay resorts. This is Cherry Grove and the Pines. You can, that picture on the left, that's me back when I had hair. As you can see from the picture, I've since lost it. But these were gay resorts, and the Pines on Fire Island, which were gay hangouts where you had lesbian hotels and gay hotels and restaurants and clubs, which it were gays and lesbians and other sexual minorities who had their evenings, who could celebrate their diversity. Of course, saunas became part of it. The famous continental baths, where Bette Midler would end up singing and putting on shows. The Eberhard baths, the piers at the end of Christopher Street, the famous St. Mark's baths. Once again, a celebration of sexuality that was not determined by the broader society, which was explored and celebrated by sexual minorities themselves. Various clubs in New York. New York was famous for its clubs, the Mine Shaft, the Hellfire Club, of course, the Rambles in Central Park during the 60s and the 70s. These were wonderful areas of gay liberation. Christopher Street would be filled with tourists and visitors on any weekend and even during the week. Now you might say, whatever happened to all of these places? Well, that's where we are going now. Artists, Andy Warhol, Truman Capote ended up celebrating their sexuality, and not gays who were off in the margins, but major artistic writers, Rudy Nureyev, conductor Leonard Bernstein, where you had architects celebrating their creativity, politicians such as Barney Frank being elected to public office. In spite of his being gay, people started saying, well, we will elect you if you are a good politician. We will go to your show or your art display, or we will read your books or listen to your music if it is good music. Whether your sexuality is one way or the other, it became irrelevant to this explosion of gay culture. So it was sexual liberation. It was out of the ghetto and into the world. Even it became popular for straight people to go to clubs like Studio 54 and Plato's Retreat, where gay, lesbian, straight, ambivalent, it didn't make any difference. Gay culture was entering the mainstream. Well, eventually, this whole movement of gay life spread around the world, where you had in the beginning of the 1990s gay movements from places in Mexico, Africa, Geneva, Cairo, Moscow, China. Once again, people were visiting New York, realizing what was going on, going to San Francisco and other cities, going to Fire Island, and taking back the good news of gay and sexual liberation in general back to their homelands. The multicolored flag became an international symbol. Christopher Street became an internationally known street. Even the word gay became international logo, where languages which didn't have a word for it, they adopted the American word gay. Well, of course, as we all know, by the 1980s, a new chapter was entering gay history. It began as the gay plague, where young men were catching the virus and there was no cure. First, it was called the gay plague, and then gradually it became known as AIDS. And the famous book by Randy Schultz, and the band played on. And this really began a new chapter where gays started dropping dead by the tens of thousands. Entire areas of artistic creativity, dancers, musicians were being assailed by the disease, which spread not only throughout the United States, but around the world. Many people use that as a criticism of gay life itself. Preachers had no problems coming out and saying this was God's punishment against gays. Many people say that gay life and lesbian life and gay liberation had run its course and it was time to go back to the ideal of heterosexual marriage. And so it really was a disaster for the movement, which began on Christopher Street. A vicious anti-gay and lesbians and sexual freedom backlash. AIDS was God's punishment. The Republicans adopted family values, rejecting the gay movement and going back to the Christian fundamentalist and evangelical Protestant family, patriarchal family. And along with the anti-gay movement, there was anti-women's movement, where women should be back in the kitchen having babies. Well, Christopher Street and other streets, such as the Piers and 42nd Street, eventually suffered urban renewal. 42nd Street was basically taken over by Disneyland and turned into a money-making entertainment area. The piers were redeveloped and gay life there was ended. The saunas, the club, many of the clubs were closed, and it really marked the end of a gay period. In fact, many people said that it was going to be the end of gay life. I love this cartoon, gays and lesbians getting married, and the man says, my God, haven't they suffered enough to inflict marriage upon gays and lesbians? But this was a whole anti-gay, lesbian, and sexual liberation movement, and it was spearheaded by evangelical Protestants, where gays should be back in the closet. The male patriarchal system of mother, father, and the kids. Issues such as gay adoption became a major issue. Gays in the military was a battleground. Gays in politics, fierce opposition. And so today we are at the beginning, if not well into, a new period in gay history. The Christopher Street era is now part of our history, but what is going to be in the future? Even around the world, we see persecution of gays and lesbians in authoritarian countries such as Russia and China and other countries where the whole liberation, which began on Christopher Street, is now under absolute siege. So I think that brings us to our end. Yes, I will stop the share here. And we are back to, for the studio, Port Washington.